He was a wealthy man, surrounded by everything money could buy, except the people who truly mattered. That day he expected nothing more than another business meeting, but then the phone rang, and on the other side of the line, a child's voice called him, "Daddy." What happened next? No fortune in the world could erase it. This story will take you through the deepest paths of regret, guilt, and love that arrives too late. It will confront you with questions you might avoid every day. Because sometimes life gives you a second chance, but time waits for no one. And when he arrived, the little girl looked into his eyes and said something you'll never forget. Subscribe so you won't miss stories like this. And tell me in the comments, which city are you watching this video from? The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Ethan Kaikura's penthouse in New Plymouth, but he barely noticed. Standing before the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Taranaki coastline, he adjusted his charcoal suit jacket with the precision of a man who had built his entire identity around control. At 42, Ethan had everything money could buy: a property portfolio spanning 3 cities, a luxury car collection, and a corner office that commanded respect from every business leader in New Zealand. Yet as he stared at his reflection in the pristine glass, something hollow stared back. The silence of his home was broken only by the soft hum of expensive appliances and the distant sound of waves against the rocks below. This was his sanctuary, his fortress of success, where no unexpected emotions could breach the walls he'd so carefully constructed. Every surface gleamed with the kind of perfection that money could purchase, but hearts could never feel. The leather furniture sat untouched. The state-of-the-art kitchen remained spotless because he rarely cooked, and the guest bedrooms had never hosted a soul. It was a monument to achievement and a mausoleum of loneliness. Ethan's phone vibrated against the marble countertop where he'd placed it whilst preparing his morning coffee. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number with a local area code. His first instinct was to ignore it. Another sales call perhaps, or someone seeking investment advice they couldn't afford. His personal assistant usually filtered such nuisances, but it was barely 7 in the morning. He let it ring once more before his business instincts took over. In his world, every call could be an opportunity, every contact a potential $1-million deal. "Ethan Kaikura speaking," he answered in his customary clipped tone, the voice of a man accustomed to cutting straight to business without pleasantries. But what came through the speaker made his blood freeze in his veins. "Papai?" The voice was small, fragile, unmistakably that of a child. "Papai, a mamãe caiu. Ela não comeu nada desde ontem." Ethan's hand trembled against the phone. Nobody called him father. Nobody had ever called him father. He'd made certain of that throughout his carefully orchestrated life. Children meant complications, emotional entanglements, the kind of messy human connections that interfered with the clean lines of profit and loss statements. "I think you've got the wrong number," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. But even as the words left his lips, something deep in his chest began to crack. "Ela caiu no chão da cozinha," the child continued, her voice growing more urgent, more desperate. "E tá dormindo ainda, mas não acorda. Tem uma coisa saindo do nariz dela. É sangue." The words hit him like physical blows. A mother collapsed on a kitchen floor. A child alone, frightened, calling for help, and somehow, impossibly, calling him. The successful businessman who prided himself on quick thinking found himself speechless, his mind reeling through possibilities he'd never allowed himself to consider. "Who is this?" he finally asked, his voice cracking despite his efforts to maintain composure. "Sou Aroha," came the reply, and the name struck him like lightning. "E a mamãe disse que, se dia a gente precisasse muito, era pra ligar pra você." Aroha, the Maori name for love. How cruelly appropriate that a word meaning love should be the one to tear down everything he thought he knew about his life. His legs felt weak, and he gripped the edge of the counter for support. "What's your mother's name?" The question escaped him before his rational mind could stop it. "Moana Tehuata." The phone slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering against the marble with a sound that seemed to echo through his soul. Moana. Sweet, stubborn, beautiful Moana who had disappeared from his life 6 years ago after one terrible argument. Moana, who had tried to tell him something important that night, something he'd been too proud and too focused on his business empire to hear. Scrambling to retrieve the phone, his hands shaking like leaves in a storm, he brought it back to his ear. "Aroha? Aroha, are you still there?" "Yes," came the small voice, now tinged with confusion and growing fear. "Are you really my papai?" Mama showed me your picture, but she said you were too important to care about us." The words were like daggers, each one finding its mark in the empty spaces of his heart he'd tried so hard to ignore. Too important to care. How many times had he used his importance, his business, his success as excuses to avoid the messy complications of human emotion? "Where are you?" he asked, his voice breaking completely now. "Wanganui, Rua Wicksteed, the yellow house with the broken fence. Please, Papai, I don't know what to do. She won't wake up and I'm scared." Ethan closed his eyes, and for a moment he was transported back 6 years to the last night he'd seen Moana. She'd stood in his office, her hand protectively placed over her stomach, tears streaming down her beautiful face as she tried to tell him something he hadn't wanted to hear. He'd been closing the biggest deal of his career, and her emotional outburst had seemed like an unwelcome distraction. He'd told her to leave, that they could talk later when he wasn't so busy. Later had never come. "I'm sorry," she'd whispered as she left his office that night. "I'm sorry for trying to matter when your work matters more." He'd never seen her again, until now, 6 years later, through the voice of a frightened child who was calling him father. "I'll be right there," he told Aroha, surprised by the conviction in his own voice. "Stay with your mum, sweetheart. Call for an ambulance if you haven't already. Tell them she's unconscious and needs help immediately." "Okay, Papai. Will you really come? You won't change your mind?" The question pierced through him like a blade. How many promises had been broken in this child's short life that she would ask such a thing? "I'll be there, I promise." After ending the call, Ethan stood motionless in his pristine kitchen, the sound of his own breathing unnaturally loud in the silence. His reflection in the chrome surface of his coffee machine showed a man he barely recognized. Pale, shaken, vulnerable, the carefully constructed walls of his existence were crumbling, and for the first time in years he felt truly, desperately afraid. Without changing from his business suit, without grabbing his wallet or even his car keys from their designated spot, he ran to his garage. His hands shook as he started the engine of his Audi, the purr of German engineering a stark contrast to the chaos in his mind. As he backed out of his driveway, leaving behind the symbol of everything he'd thought mattered, he caught a glimpse of himself in the rearview mirror. The man looking back was no longer the confident businessman who had awakened that morning. Instead, he saw someone he'd thought he'd buried long ago. A man capable of love, of fear, of regret so profound, it threatened to drown him. The drive to Wanganui would take just over an hour, but every minute felt like an eternity. As the landscape blurred past his windows, Ethan found himself remembering fragments of conversations with Moana, moments of tenderness he'd dismissed as irrelevant to his grand plans for success. She'd spoken of family, of building something lasting together, of love that transcended bank accounts and business achievements. He'd laughed at her romantic notions then. He wasn't laughing now. Somewhere ahead of him waited a woman who had once loved him, and a child who carried his DNA, his legacy, his blood. A child who had grown up without him, who knew him only through a photograph and stories that clearly painted him as the villain of her young life. As the familiar landmarks of Wanganui came into view, Ethan realized he was about to face the consequences of every choice he'd made in the pursuit of success. The empire he'd built suddenly felt as fragile as paper, while the family he'd never known he had became the only thing that seemed real. The yellow house with the broken fence was just ahead, and with it, a reckoning 6 years in the making. The yellow paint on the weatherboard house had faded to the color of old buttercups, peeling away in long strips that hung like dying skin from the timber beneath. Ethan's luxury car looked obscene parked outside the broken gate, its gleaming chrome and pristine paint job a stark contrast to the poverty that surrounded it. As he stepped onto the cracked concrete path, his Italian leather shoes crunched on dead leaves that nobody had bothered to sweep away. But it was the ambulance that made his heart stop. 2 paramedics were wheeling a stretcher toward the back of their vehicle, and on it lay a woman so thin, so frail, that for a moment Ethan couldn't reconcile this broken figure with the vibrant Moana he remembered. Her dark hair, once lustrous and full of life, hung limp against the white pillow. Her skin had taken on the waxy pallor of someone whose body was failing, and the oxygen mask over her face seemed to swallow the delicate features he'd once traced with his fingers in happier times. Standing beside the ambulance was an elderly Maori woman, holding a small child against her ample frame. The woman's weathered face was streaked with tears, and she was speaking in rapid, hushed Maori to the paramedics. But it was the child who made Ethan's world tilt on its axis. Aroha was impossibly small, even for 6 years old, as though poverty had stunted not just her growth, but her very presence in the world. Her dark hair hung in tangled waves around a face that was unmistakably his own. The same deep-set brown eyes, the same stubborn jawline, the same slightly crooked smile that his mother had always said made him look mischievous, but where his eyes held the hardness of years in boardrooms and bitter negotiations, hers held a wariness that no child should possess. She was wearing clothes that had clearly seen better days. A purple cardigan several sizes too large that hung off her tiny shoulders, jeans with patches on both knees, and shoes that had been repaired so many times they were more tape than leather. Yet around her neck hung something that looked precious, a pendant carved from greenstone that caught the morning light and seemed to glow against her small chest. When Aroha saw him approaching, her body tense like a small animal sensing a predator. Her fingers gripped the elderly woman's dress more tightly, and those familiar brown eyes, his eyes, studied him with an intensity that made him feel as though she was looking straight through to his soul. "You came," she said simply, her voice carrying none of the relief he'd expected to hear. Instead, there was surprise, as though she'd learned not to count on adults keeping their promises. The paramedic closest to him, a middle-aged Pakaha man with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, looked up from his clipboard. "Are you family?" Ethan started, then stopped. What was he? The father who'd never known he was a father? The man who'd abandoned them before he even knew they existed? "Yes, I'm Aroha's father." The words felt foreign in his mouth, like speaking a language he'd never learned. But as soon as he said them, something shifted in the little girl's expression. Not warmth, not yet, but a kind of cautious recognition, as though a puzzle piece had finally clicked into place. "Ms. Tehuata is severely malnourished," the paramedic continued, his voice gentle but clinical. "When did she last eat a proper meal?" Ethan looked helplessly at Aroha, who shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. The elderly woman, whom he now recognized as Mrs. Millionaire from down the street, answered in a voice thick with emotion. "The child says her mother hasn't eaten in 3 days. Been giving all the food to the little one." Mrs. Millionaire's eyes were accusatory as they fixed on Ethan. "Where have you been, eh? This woman's been struggling for months, too proud to ask for help, too scared to burden anyone." The accusation hit him like a physical blow. While he'd been counting his millions and expanding his empire, the mother of his child had been starving herself to keep their daughter fed. The contrast was so stark, so horrible, that for a moment he couldn't breathe. "Is she?" he began, but couldn't finish the question. "We're taking her to Whanganui Hospital," the paramedic said. "She's stable for now, but..." He glanced meaningfully at Aroha and lowered his voice. "She's very sick, mate. This isn't just malnutrition. There's something else going on." As the ambulance pulled away with its precious cargo, Ethan found himself standing on the broken path with a child who was his daughter, but a complete stranger, feeling more lost than he'd ever felt in his carefully ordered life. Mrs. Hanar had retreated to her own house after extracting a promise from him that he wouldn't disappear again like a coward, leaving them alone with the weight of 6 years of absence hanging between them. "Do you want to see inside?" Aroha asked, her voice matter-of-fact despite the magnitude of everything that had just happened. The interior of the house was worse than he'd imagined. The front door opened directly into a living room that held only the bare necessities: a worn couch that had clearly seen better decades, a small television on a wobbly table, and shelves made from planks and concrete blocks that held a few precious books and what looked like school projects. The carpet was threadbare in places, and he could see where it had been carefully cleaned around stains that wouldn't come out. But it was the kitchen that truly broke him. The cupboards were practically empty. A tin of baked beans, a bag of rice with perhaps a cup left in it, a jar of peanut butter scraped so clean he could see the bottom. The refrigerator hummed loudly, working harder than it should, and when Aroha opened it to show him, he saw only a carton of milk that smelled sour and a few sad vegetables that had seen better days. "Mom always said we should be grateful for what we have," Aroha said, carefully closing the fridge door. "She said some people have even less." On the small kitchen table was an exercise book open to a page of carefully practiced handwriting. The heading read, "What I Did on the Weekend," and below it, in a child's neat script, "On Saturday I helped Mum in the garden. We planted beans because they grow fast and we can eat them. On Sunday we went to the beach and collected shells. Mum says the ocean gives us beautiful things for free. I found a pink one shaped like a butterfly. The innocence of it, the determination to find joy in poverty, made Ethan's throat constrict with emotion he didn't know how to handle. She helps me with my homework every night, Aroha continued, running her small finger along the lines of writing. Even when she's tired, she says education is the one thing nobody can take away from you. As they moved through the tiny house, Ethan began to piece together the life that had been lived here without him. In the bathroom, he found a shelf lined with library books about teaching and early childhood development. Moana's dreams of becoming a teacher, apparently still alive despite everything. In the bedroom they'd clearly shared, he saw a mattress on the floor covered with blankets that had been mended multiple times, and beside it, a small pile of Aroha's school clothes laid out for the next day. But it was what he found on the bedside table that nearly brought him to his knees. A photograph, faded and creased from handling, showed him and Moana from 6 years ago. They were at the beach in New Plymouth, both laughing at something he could no longer remember. His arm around her shoulders, her hand resting on his chest. They looked young, hopeful, deeply in love. Behind the photograph was a small stack of letters, tied with a ribbon. With trembling hands, he untied the ribbon and opened the top letter. It was addressed to his company, dated 5.5 years ago, but the envelope had never been opened. Inside, in Moana's careful handwriting, was a plea that made his heart shatter. Dear Ethan, I don't know if this letter will reach you, or if you'll read it if it does. I know you're busy building your empire, and I know you said you didn't want complications in your life, but I thought you should know that our daughter was born last week. Her name is Aroha, and she has your eyes and your stubborn chin. She's perfect and she's yours whether you want her or not. I'm not asking for money or marriage or anything that would interfere with your important life. I just thought, I hoped that maybe someday you might want to know her. She deserves to know she has a father who accomplished amazing things, even if he doesn't have time for her. If you ever change your mind, we're at the address on the envelope, but I won't write again. I promise. All my love, Moana. P.S. She smiled today for the first time. I think she was trying to tell me something, but I don't speak baby yet. Maybe you would have understood. The letter slipped from his fingers and fluttered to the floor. Behind him, he heard Aroha's small voice. You never got her letters, did you? He turned to find her standing in the doorway, those knowing eyes far too old for her young face. She wasn't accusatory, just tired, as though she'd already learned that disappointment was as much a part of life as breathing. No, he whispered, his voice breaking. I never got them. She nodded as though this confirmed something she'd already suspected. Mom said you were probably too busy to read them anyway. She said important men don't have time for little girls and their mothers. Aroha, It's okay, she interrupted. But there was nothing okay about the resignation in her voice. Mom explained that some people are just too big for small lives like ours. The condemnation in those simple words was worse than any courtroom sentence. Standing in that poor house, surrounded by evidence of lives lived in struggle while he'd accumulated wealth, Ethan finally understood the true cost of his success. I'm not too big, he said, kneeling down so he was at her eye level. I was just lost, but I'm here now. Aroha studied his face for a long moment, and he could see her weighing his words against 6 years of experience with broken promises from the adult world. Are you going to stay? She asked finally. Yes, even when it gets hard. Even when I'm sad or scared or when I miss Mum too much. The questions revealed a wisdom that no 6-year-old should possess, born from having to be more mature than her years demanded. Especially then, he promised. And for the first time since he'd arrived, he saw a flicker of something that might have been hope in her eyes. As the afternoon sun slanted through the small windows of the house that poverty had claimed but love had sustained, Ethan realized that everything he'd thought he knew about success was about to be redefined by a small girl who called him father, and a woman fighting for her life in a hospital bed. Wanganui Hospital's fluorescent lights cast a harsh, unforgiving glow over everything, bleaching the color from the world and making everyone look like ghosts of themselves. Ethan sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair beside Moana's bed, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest beneath the thin hospital blanket, and tried to reconcile this fragile woman with the fierce, independent spirit he'd fallen in love with 6 years ago. The diagnosis had been delivered with the clinical detachment that doctors learned to perfect. Stage 3 cervical cancer, aggressive and spreading faster than anyone had hoped. The malnutrition had weakened her immune system, making treatment more complicated, more uncertain. Dr. Sarah Williams, a compassionate woman in her 50s with tired eyes that had seen too much suffering, explained that Moana had been ignoring symptoms for months, possibly longer. She was more concerned about keeping her daughter fed than seeking medical attention for herself. Dr. Williams had said, her voice heavy with the weight of too many similar stories. It's more common than you'd think, especially among single mothers in financial hardship. They put everyone else first. The words had hit Ethan like physical blows. While he'd been flying first class to business meetings and dining in expensive restaurants, the mother of his child had been slowly dying, sacrificing her health and her future for their daughter's present. The irony was bitter enough to choke on. He had millions he'd never spend, and she'd died by degrees for want of a few $100s in regular medical care. Aroha had insisted on coming to the hospital, despite Mrs. Hanar's gentle suggestions that perhaps she should wait at home. She sat now in a chair that was too big for her small frame, her legs dangling several inches from the floor, clutching a drawing she'd made during the long hours of waiting. The picture showed 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a yellow sun, but one of the figures was lying down while the other 2 stood beside it. "That's Mom," she'd explained matter-of-factly when Ethan asked about the drawing. "She's resting so she can get better and come home with us." The casual way she said "us" had nearly undone him. After less than 24 hours, this wise, wounded little girl was already trying to build a family from the wreckage of her mother's illness and his years of absence. As evening approached and visiting hours drew to a close, Ethan found himself reluctant to leave the hospital. The sterile environment, the constant beeping of monitors, the antiseptic smell that couldn't quite mask the underlying scent of human suffering. It all felt more real than his penthouse had ever been. Here, surrounded by the consequences of his choices, he couldn't hide behind spreadsheets and profit margins. "You should take her somewhere comfortable for the night," Dr. Williams suggested gently. "We'll call if there's any change. But she needs rest, and so does your daughter." The word daughter still felt foreign on everyone's lips when applied to his relationship with Aroha, but the little girl didn't seem to notice. She gathered her coloring pencils and the drawing with the careful precision of someone who'd learned early that possessions were precious and easily lost. "Will you read to Mum while we're gone?" she asked the nurse on duty, a kind-faced Maori woman named Mere whose smile reached her eyes. She liked stories about the ocean. They help her sleep. "Of course, sweetheart," Mere replied, ruffling Aroha's tangled hair. "I know some beautiful stories about Tangaroa and his treasures." As they walked through the hospital corridors toward the exit, Aroha slipped her small hand into Ethan's. The gesture was so natural, so trusting, that it stopped him in his tracks. Her fingers were tiny and warm against his palm, and for a moment he was overwhelmed by the responsibility those small fingers represented. "Are you scared?" she asked, looking up at him with those knowing eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. He could have lied, given her the reassuring adult response that everything would be fine. Instead, he found himself being honest in a way he hadn't been with anyone in years. "Yes," he admitted. "I'm terrified." She nodded as though this was the answer she'd expected. "Me too. But Mum says it's okay to be scared as long as you don't let it stop you from doing what needs to be done." The wisdom in those words, coming from someone who still counted her age on 2 hands, humbled him completely. They drove to the nicest hotel in Wanganui, a modest establishment that would have seemed impossibly luxurious to a child who'd grown up in a house where every penny was counted twice. Aroha's eyes went wide at the carpeted lobby, the crystal chandelier, the uniformed staff who smiled and called her Miss. "Is this where rich people live?" she whispered as they rode the elevator to their room. "Some of them," Ethan replied, then added quietly, "But living somewhere nice doesn't make you rich in the ways that matter." Their adjoining rooms were comfortable but unremarkable. Exactly the kind of accommodation he would have dismissed as inadequate just days earlier. Now watching Aroha explore every corner with wonder, examining the complimentary toiletries as though they were treasures, he saw luxury through her eyes and felt ashamed of his previous entitlement. As she settled into the large bed, dwarfed by pillows that cost more than her family's weekly grocery budget, Ethan found himself studying her face in the lamplight. The resemblance was undeniable. She had his stubborn chin, his deep-set eyes, even the way he unconsciously chewed his lower lip when thinking. But there was something else there too, something that came from Moana, a gentleness, a natural empathy that his years in business had nearly beaten out of him. "Can you tell me about my mum?" Aroha asked suddenly, her voice small in the quiet room. About what she was like before she got sick? The question caught him off guard. He'd spent so many years trying to forget Moana, to bury the memory of what they'd had together beneath layers of professional achievement and emotional detachment. Now, faced with his daughter's hungry eyes, he found himself remembering things he thought he'd lost forever. She was the strongest person I ever knew. He began slowly, and the kindest. She used to volunteer at the animal shelter on weekends, even though she could barely afford to feed herself. She said every living thing deserved love and care. Aroha smiled at this, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. She still does that. Well, she did. She brings home injured birds sometimes, keeps them in a box until they're better. She was studying to be a teacher when I met her, Ethan continued, the memories flowing more freely now. She said she wanted to help children learn that they could be anything they wanted to be, no matter where they came from. She helps me with my reading every night, Aroha said proudly. I'm the best reader in my class. The pride in her voice made his chest ache. Here was a child who had every reason to be bitter about her circumstances, yet she glowed with love for a mother who had given her everything despite having so little. She loved to dance, he remembered suddenly. Maori traditional dances, but also modern music. She said dancing was like prayer, a way to talk to the universe with your whole body. She taught me the haka, Aroha said, sitting up in the bed. Want to see? Before he could respond, she was on her feet, performing the traditional Maori dance with surprising grace and power for someone so small. Her movements were precise, passionate, and as she chanted in Te Reo Maori, Ethan could see Moana in every gesture, every expression. When she finished, they were both crying. Mum says the haka connects us to our ancestors, Aroha explained, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. She says even when we're scared or alone, we're never really alone because all the people who loved us before are still with us. That night, as Aroha finally drifted off to sleep, Ethan sat by the window looking out at the lights of Wanganui and thinking about connections. For years, he'd prided himself on his independence, his ability to succeed without relying on anyone else. Now he understood that his isolation hadn't been strength, it had been cowardice. He'd been so afraid of being hurt, of being vulnerable, that he'd cut himself off from the very things that gave life meaning. Somewhere in this sleeping town was a woman fighting for her life, a woman who had loved him completely and received abandonment in return. And beside him, in a hotel bed that cost more per night than most families spent on food in a week, was a child who shared his DNA, but had been raised with values he'd forgotten he ever possessed. As the hours stretched toward dawn, Ethan made a silent promise to both of them and to the man he used to be before success had hardened his heart. He would learn to be the father Aroha deserved, and somehow, if it wasn't too late, he would find a way to earn Moana's forgiveness. But first he had to forgive himself for 6 years of choices that had brought them all to this moment. And as he watched his daughter sleep, her small hand clutching the green stone pendant that connected her to ancestors he'd never helped her know, Ethan realized that the hardest part wasn't going to be learning to love them. The hardest part was going to be learning to live with the knowledge of how much love he'd already wasted. The decision to stay hadn't been conscious. It had been inevitable, like gravity or breathing. Ethan found himself canceling meetings, delegating responsibilities, and ignoring increasingly frantic calls from his business partners as he threw himself into the unfamiliar rhythm of caring for a 6-year-old girl who was slowly, cautiously beginning to trust him. Their days developed a pattern that was both foreign and strangely comforting. Morning visits to the hospital, where Moana drifted in and out of consciousness, her condition stabilizing but far from improving. Afternoons exploring Wanganui, the river walks, the small cafes, the local museum where Aroha delighted in showing him exhibits about Maori history that she already knew by heart. Evenings in their hotel room, where she would draw pictures of their day while he learned to braid her hair and help with homework that seemed impossibly advanced for someone so young. It was during one of these quiet evening moments that Aroha looked up from her mathematics worksheet and asked the question that had been hanging between them since that first phone call. "Why didn't you want me when I was little?" The pencil in his hand snapped under the pressure of his grip. She wasn't looking at him when she asked it, her attention apparently focused on the subtraction problems in front of her. But he could see the tension in her small shoulders, the way she held her breath while waiting for his answer. "I didn't know about you," he said carefully, choosing his words like a man navigating a minefield. "Your mom tried to tell me, but I wasn't listening. I was too busy with work." too focused on things that seemed important at the time. But what if you had known? She pressed, still not meeting his eyes. Would you have wanted me then? The question hit him like a physical blow because he wasn't sure he could honestly answer it the way she needed him to. 6 years ago, would he have chosen fatherhood over his empire? Would he have welcomed the complications, the emotional demands, the complete reorganization of priorities that a child required? I don't know, he admitted finally, and her pencil stopped moving across the paper. 6 years ago, I thought success was measured by money and power and how many people knew my name. I thought love was a weakness that would hold me back from achieving great things. She looked up at him then, those familiar brown eyes serious and searching. And now? Now I know that I was wrong about everything that mattered. It wasn't enough. He could see that in her expression. But it was honest. And somehow that seemed more important than pretty lies or reassuring platitudes. She went back to her mathematics with a small nod. And he understood that trust would be built in moments like this, through accumulated small truths rather than grand gestures. The next morning brought a breakthrough of sorts. When they arrived at the hospital, Moana was awake and alert for the first time since her collapse. Her eyes found Ethan immediately, and the look that passed between them carried 6 years of unspoken words, recriminations, and regrets. "You came," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but heavy with complex emotions he couldn't begin to untangle. "Of course I came." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Now, after all this time, when it's too late to matter? Aroha had gone to the hospital's children's play area with Mire, the kind nurse who had taken a special interest in their unusual family situation. They were alone for the first time since he'd received that devastating phone call, and the weight of everything unsaid pressed down on them like a physical force. "Moana, don't," she interrupted, struggling to sit up straighter despite the obvious pain it caused her. "Don't you dare apologize to me, Ethan. Not when your assistant told me you didn't have time for ex-girlfriends with problems." The words hit him like ice water. "What?" "I called your office," she continued, her voice growing stronger with anger. "When Aroha was 3 months old and I was working 3 jobs just to keep us fed. I swallowed my pride and called because I thought maybe you had a right to know about your daughter." Ethan's mind raced through possibilities, through the efficient gatekeepers who had protected his time and filtered his calls for years. How many important conversations had been dismissed as unworthy of his attention? How many lives had his pursuit of efficiency and control affected without his knowledge? Someone answered and said they were your personal assistant, Moana went on, tears streaming down her gaunt cheeks. "I told them my name, said I had something important to discuss with you about our time together. Do you know what they said?" He couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, could only shake his head as the horrific picture became clear. "They said you'd made it very clear that you weren't to be bothered by former romantic entanglements seeking financial assistance. They said if I was experiencing financial difficulties, I should contact social services, not successful businessmen who had moved on with their lives." The room spun around him. Somewhere in his efficient corporate machine, someone had made a decision that destroyed 3 lives. Someone had taken it upon themselves to protect him from the inconvenience of his own daughter's existence. "I hung up before I could finish telling them why I was calling," Moana whispered. "I never got to say that I wasn't asking for money. I just wanted you to know that you had a daughter who looked like you and laughed like you and deserved to know where she came from. Moana, I swear to you, I never knew." "It doesn't matter now," she said, but her voice cracked on the words. "I spent 6 years teaching our daughter that her father was too important for little girls and their mothers. 6 years making excuses for why you never called or visited or sent a birthday card. 6 years watching her face every Father's Day when all her classmates made cards for men who actually wanted to be fathers." The accusation in her words was devastating, but worse was the resignation. She wasn't angry anymore. She was defeated, worn down by years of struggling alone and protecting their daughter from the truth of his abandonment. "I'm here now," he said desperately. "I want to be her father now." "Now?" Moana's laugh was bitter and broken. "Now when I'm dying? Now when she's about to lose the only parent she's ever really had? How convenient for you, Ethan. You get to swoop in and be the hero who saves the day, just when it no longer requires any real sacrifice from you." The words were like knives, each one finding its mark in the guilt and shame he'd been carrying since Aroha's first phone call. But underneath the cruelty was pain so profound, it made his chest ache in sympathy. "You're not dying," he said firmly. though even as the words left his mouth, he could see in her eyes that they both knew it wasn't true. Stage 3 cervical cancer, Ethan. Spread to my lymph nodes, possibly further. They're going to try treatment, but she shrugged with the forced casualness of someone who had already made peace with their mortality. I ignored the symptoms for too long because I couldn't afford to be sick, couldn't afford the time off work, couldn't afford the medical bills, couldn't afford to leave Aroha alone while I dealt with doctors and treatments. Why didn't you have regular checkups? Preventive care? The question was naive, and he knew it as soon as he asked. She looked at him with something approaching pity. With what money, Ethan? Do you know what it costs to raise a child on a teacher's aide salary? Do you know what it's like to choose between your own health and your child's next meal? He didn't know, had never had to know. While she'd been making impossible choices between medicine and groceries, he'd been spending more on a single business dinner than she probably saw in a month. I kept every newspaper clipping about your success, she said quietly. Every business award, every promotion, every time your company expanded. I told myself I was keeping them for Aroha so she could know her father was accomplished and successful. But really, I think I was torturing myself, reminding myself every day of what we weren't worth to you. The confession broke something inside him. The image of Moana carefully cutting out newspaper articles about his achievements while struggling to keep their daughter fed was almost too painful to bear. You were worth everything, he whispered. You are worth everything, both of you. Don't say that, she said sharply. Don't you dare say that when your actions proved the exact opposite for 6 years. They sat in silence after that, the machines beeping steadily around them, the antiseptic smell of the hospital heavy in the air. Through the window, Ethan could see the car park, where his expensive car sat among the modest vehicles of other families dealing with their own crises. The visual metaphor wasn't lost on him. She loves you already, you know, Moana said eventually, her voice softer now. Aroha. She's been starved for a father figure her whole life, and you showed up at exactly the moment when she needed someone most. But love isn't enough, Ethan. Not if you're going to disappear the moment this gets difficult or inconvenient. I won't disappear. You did before. I didn't know. You didn't want to know, she corrected, and the accuracy of the accusation silenced him completely. She was right. 6 years ago, when she'd tried to tell him something important, he hadn't disappeared because he was unaware of her pregnancy. He'd disappeared because he'd sensed that she was about to complicate his carefully ordered life, and he'd chosen his ambitions over her needs. I want custody, he said suddenly, surprising himself with the declaration. Moana's eyes widened. What? When? If? He couldn't say the words, couldn't voice the possibility of her death. I want to raise her. I want to be her father in every way that matters. She's not a project, Ethan. She's not a business acquisition or a problem to be solved with money. She's a little girl who's lost too much already and needs stability, consistency, unconditional love. Can you give her that? Can you put her needs before your own ambition? Can you be present for scraped knees and bad dreams and school plays and teenage heartbreak? Yes, even when it means missing important meetings? Even when she's difficult or demanding, or when she pushes you away because she's grieving? Yes, even when the novelty wears off and the reality of single parenthood hits you, and you realize that raising a child is the hardest thing you'll ever do? Yes. She studied his face for a long moment, searching for something he hoped she would find. She'll fight you, Moana warned. When I'm gone, she'll be angry and scared, and she'll blame you for not being there before. She'll test every boundary, question every rule, push every button to see if you'll abandon her like she thinks you abandoned us. I can handle that. Can you? Because loving her isn't enough. You have to love her even when she makes it difficult. You have to love her through the worst parts of grief and adolescence and all the ways she'll try to push you away. I will. Moana closed her eyes, and for a moment he thought she'd drifted off again. But then she spoke, so quietly, he had to lean closer to hear her. I'll consider it, but first you have to prove to me that you understand what you're asking for. Spend the next week with her. Really with her. Not just playing dress up as a father when it's convenient. Take her to school. Help with homework, deal with tantrums and fears and all the messy reality of what it means to be responsible for another human being. And then we'll see if you still want to be her father when you understand what it really costs. The test began immediately. That very afternoon, when they collected Aroha from the hospital play area, Moana's challenge hung between them like an unspoken contract. Ethan found himself hyper-aware of every interaction, every decision, wondering if he was being judged and found wanting. But it was Aroha herself who provided the first real lesson in what fatherhood actually meant. She'd been quiet during the drive back to the hotel, staring out the window at the Wanganui River as it wound its way through the town. Her small hands were folded in her lap, and there was something about her posture that suggested she was carrying thoughts too heavy for her young shoulders. "Can we go somewhere?" she asked suddenly, as they pulled into the hotel car park. "Where would you like to go? Somewhere that isn't a hotel or a hospital. Somewhere that feels..." She paused, searching for the right word. "Free." The request was so simple, so reasonable, that it took him a moment to realize he had no idea where to take a 6-year-old for an afternoon of feeling free. His world had been constrained by boardrooms and business lunches, 5-star restaurants and exclusive clubs. The playground of childhood was foreign territory to him. "What did you and your mom like to do together?" he asked, pulling back out onto the street. "We went to Tongariro once," she said, her face lighting up with the memory. "Mom said it was where the earth touches the sky, and that if you listened carefully you could hear the mountains singing." Tongariro National Park was 2 hours away, but looking at Aroha's hopeful expression, Ethan found himself indicating toward the highway without a second thought. He sent a quick text to cancel his evening conference call with Singapore and turned the car toward the mountains. The drive gave them time to talk in a way they hadn't managed before. Aroha told him about school, about her teacher, Mrs. Patterson, who smelled like lavender and always had plasters with cartoon characters for scraped knees. She told him about her best friend Kaya, who lived 3 houses down and whose grandmother made the best boil-up in Wanganui. She told him about the vegetable garden she and Moana had planted behind their house, and how proud she'd been when the beans she'd planted had grown tall enough to climb. "Mom says plants are like people," she said, watching the countryside roll past the window. "They grow toward the light, but they need strong roots to survive the storms." The wisdom in her observation, delivered so matter-of-factly, made him glance at her in the rear-view mirror. Where had this child learned to speak in metaphors? How had poverty and struggle produced someone so thoughtful, so grounded in understanding that many adults never achieved? When they reached the national park, the late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the volcanic landscape. The mountains rose before them like ancient guardians, their peaks touched with clouds that seemed to glow from within. Aroha was out of the car before he'd even turned off the engine, running toward the walking track with the boundless energy that only children possess. "Careful," he called after her, his business-trained mind immediately cataloging potential dangers: uneven terrain, wild animals, the possibility of getting lost. But she was already 50 meters ahead, her laughter carrying back to him on the mountain air. For the next hour, he followed his daughter through a landscape that seemed designed to humble human ambition. The volcanic rock formations told stories spanning millennia, while the native bush whispered secrets that had nothing to do with profit margins or quarterly reports. Aroha moved through it all with the confidence of someone who belonged in natural spaces, pointing out bird calls and explaining which plants were safe to touch. It was she who spotted the fox. They'd stopped to rest beside a small stream when movement in the nearby undergrowth caught her attention. A red fox emerged cautiously from behind a cluster of manuka trees, its russet coat gleaming in the dappled sunlight. It should have been afraid of them, should have bolted at the first sign of human presence. Instead, it sat on its haunches and regarded them with intelligent amber eyes. "Look," Aroha whispered, barely breathing the word. "It's beautiful." The fox tilted its head as if considering her comment, then did something extraordinary. It trotted closer, stopping just a few meters away, and lay down in the grass. For several minutes they formed an unlikely tableau: man, child, and wild creature sharing a moment of perfect stillness. When the fox finally rose and disappeared back into the bush, Aroha turned to Ethan with tears in her eyes. But these weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of pure joy, the kind that come from experiencing something transcendent and unexpected. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice full of wonder. "It wasn't afraid of us. It came to say hello." Ethan nodded, unable to speak around the sudden tightness in his throat. In that moment, watching his daughter's face radiate happiness, he understood something fundamental about what he'd been missing. It wasn't just that he'd missed 6 years of her life. He'd missed 6 years of seeing the world through eyes that could find magic in unexpected places. "Mom says animals can sense good hearts," Aroha continued, settling back down beside the stream. "She says they only come close to people who won't hurt them." "What do you think?" he asked, sitting beside her on the rocky bank. "I think the fox was checking to see if you're really my father," she said with the absolute certainty that children bring to their magical thinking, and I think it decided you are. On the drive back to Wanganui, Aroha fell asleep in the back seat, her small face peaceful in the glow of the dashboard lights. Ethan found himself stealing glances at her in the mirror, marveling at how dramatically his life had changed in just a few days. The business empire that had once seemed like the most important thing in the world now felt like a distant concern, secondary to the sleeping child in his care. That evening, while Aroha drew pictures of their mountain adventure, he sat beside her bed and watched her work. Her tongue poked out slightly as she concentrated, and her brow furrowed in exactly the same way his did when he was thinking hard. The drawing showed two figures standing beside a stream, with a red fox sitting nearby and mountains rising in the background. "That's us," she explained, adding careful details to the fox's bushy tail. "And that's our friend Fox. Mom always says you should draw the things that make you happy so you can remember them when you're sad." She signed the drawing with her name in careful letters, then added something that made his heart skip. "Aroha and Dad at the mountains." Dad, not Ethan. Not the man who says he's my father. Dad. The next morning brought a phone call from the hospital. Moana had asked to see him, alone. When he arrived at her bedside, she was sitting up and looking more alert than he'd seen her since the collapse. There was something different in her expression, a softness that hadn't been there during their painful conversation the day before. "Aroha showed me her drawing," she said without preamble. "She said you saw a fox together, and that it came to say hello." "We did. She also said you canceled a work call to take her to the mountains, and that you didn't check your phone once during the entire afternoon." He hadn't realized she'd noticed. It seemed more important to be present with her. Moana nodded slowly. 6 years ago, you couldn't go 10 minutes without checking your phone. You took business calls during dinner, during movies, during intimate moments. Work always came first. Things have changed. Have they? Or are you just playing a role because you feel guilty? The question was fair, and he considered it carefully before answering. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe it started as guilt. But watching her yesterday, seeing how she finds joy in simple things, seeing the world through her eyes, I think I'm changing because she's changing me. She has that effect on people," Moana said with a small smile. "She's always been able to see the good in everyone even when they can't see it in themselves. Like her mother." "No," Moana said firmly. "Like herself. Don't give me credit for who she is, Ethan. Aroha became the person she is despite our circumstances, not because of them. She chose kindness when life gave her every reason to be bitter. She chose hope when everything around her suggested she should give up." As if summoned by their conversation, Aroha appeared in the doorway clutching a small wooden box. She'd insisted on coming to the hospital that morning, despite Ethan's gentle suggestion that perhaps she should rest after their long day in the mountains. "I brought you something, Mum," she said, climbing carefully onto the bed. Inside the box was a collection of small treasures: a perfectly round stone from the beach, a pressed flower, a feather from some long-forgotten bird encounter, and a small photograph of the three of them taken just days earlier by a kind nurse. "These are all my favorite things," Aroha explained. "I thought maybe if you kept them close, they'd help you remember all the happy times when you're feeling sick." Moana's eyes filled with tears as she examined each treasure. "They're perfect, my love. I'll keep them right here beside my bed. And when you come home, we can add more things. Me and Dad can take you to see the fox, and we can collect new treasures together." The casual way she included Ethan in her future plans, the natural assumption that he would be part of their family adventures, made something shift in Moana's expression. She looked at him over Aroha's head with a mixture of surprise and cautious hope. Later, after Aroha had gone to find Mire and show her the leftover treasures from her collection, Moana reached for Ethan's hand. "She's never called anyone Dad before," she said quietly. "She's never even asked about you in a way that suggested she thought of you as a real person, rather than a character in a story. What does that mean?" "It means she's starting to trust you, and that scares me more than my illness does." "Why?" "Because if you break her heart now after she's let herself believe in you, I don't think she'll ever recover. She's already lost so much. She can't lose another parent." The weight of responsibility in those words was enormous. He was being trusted with more than custody. He was being trusted with a child's capacity for love, her ability to believe in the goodness of adults, her willingness to hope for better things. "I won't let her down," he promised. "You can't know that. No one can promise they won't make mistakes as a parent. But what you can promise is that you'll stay, even when it's hard." even when she's difficult or when you don't know what you're doing. Can you promise that? Yes. Because staying isn't just about physical presence, Ethan. It's about emotional availability. It's about putting her needs first, even when it conflicts with what you want. It's about loving her enough to get help when you don't know how to handle something, rather than pretending you have all the answers. I understand. Moana studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I think you might actually mean that. I do. Then I'll draw up the paperwork for custody. But Ethan? She gripped his hand tighter. This is your last chance to walk away. Once you commit to being her father, there's no going back. She'll be your responsibility for the rest of your life, even when she's grown and has children of her own. Even when you're old and tired and wonder if you made the right choice. Are you absolutely certain this is what you want? He thought about the fox in the mountains, about Aroha's drawing signed with Dad, about the way she'd fallen asleep in the car, trusting him to bring her safely home. He thought about all the birthdays he'd missed, all the bedtime stories he'd never read, all the scraped knees he hadn't kissed better. He thought about the man he'd been before that phone call, and the man he was becoming because of a little girl who saw magic in ordinary moments. Yes, he said, and this time the word carried the weight of absolute certainty. This is what I want. She's what I want. Being her father is what I want. Moana smiled then, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since his return. Good, because she's already chosen you, whether you realize it or not. Last night she told me she dreamed about teaching you to plant vegetables and showing you how to braid hair properly. In her mind, you're already family. That evening, back at the hotel, Aroha presented him with another drawing. This one showed their house in Wanganui, but it had been transformed. The broken fence was mended, the garden was full of flourishing plants, and there were 3 figures standing in front of it. A woman, a man, and a small girl holding both their hands. This is what it could look like, she said simply, when Mom gets better and we're all together. Ethan looked at the drawing and saw more than a child's wishful thinking. He saw a blueprint for the life he'd never known he wanted, a future where success was measured not in profit margins, but in shared laughter, where the most important meetings were the ones held around kitchen tables, where the greatest achievement was earning the trust of a small girl who called him Dad. I'd like that very much, he told her, and meant every word. Outside their hotel window, the lights of Wanganui twinkled like stars, and somewhere in the distance the mountains they'd visited that day stood sentinel against the night sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new lessons in what it meant to be a father. But tonight, as he watched his daughter carefully place her drawing in the growing collection of treasures that documented their time together, Ethan finally understood what Moana had been trying to tell him 6 years ago. Love wasn't a weakness that would hold him back from achieving great things. Love was the only great thing worth achieving. The call came at 3 a.m, piercing through the hotel room's silence like a scream. Ethan fumbled for his phone in the darkness, his heart already racing with the dread that only middle-of-the-night calls from hospitals can bring. Aroha stirred in the bed beside him. She'd been having nightmares and had crawled in with him around midnight, seeking the comfort of not being alone with her fears. Mr. Kaikura, this is Mira from Wanganui Hospital. Moana is asking for you. She's very weak tonight. She specifically requested that you come alone. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Ethan looked down at Aroha's sleeping face, peaceful in the glow from the hallway light, and felt his world tilt on its axis. She'd been so hopeful lately, so convinced that her mother would get better and they could all be a family together. How could he shatter that faith? I'll be right there, he whispered into the phone. He left a note for Aroha, telling her he'd gone to check on her mom and would be back soon. The lie felt bitter on his tongue, but the truth, that this might be goodbye, was too heavy for a 6-year-old to carry alone in a hotel room at dawn. The hospital corridors were eerily quiet, populated only by the soft-soled footsteps of night shift workers and the distant sound of machines keeping vigil over the sick and dying. Moana's room was dimly lit, the harsh fluorescence replaced by a small bedside lamp that cast gentle shadows across her gaunt features. She looked impossibly fragile against the white hospital linens, her once beautiful face now hollow with illness, her breathing shallow and labored, but her eyes were alert when they found his, burning with an intensity that spoke of urgent things left unsaid. Close the door, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the quiet hum of medical equipment. He did as she asked, then pulled the visitor's chair close to her bedside. Up close he could see the waxy pallor of her skin, The way her lips had taken on a bluish tinge that spoke of a body slowly shutting down despite all the medical interventions. "You have the right to leave," she said without preamble, each word clearly costing her precious energy. "Even now, even after everything we've talked about, being a single father to a grieving child, it's going to be harder than anything you've ever done. You can still walk away and no one would blame you." "I'm not walking away. She's going to fight you," Moana continued as if he hadn't spoken. "When I'm gone, she'll be angry and scared and looking for someone to blame. She'll test every boundary, question every rule, push every button to see if you'll abandon her like she thinks you abandoned us." Ethan leaned closer, taking her cold hand in both of his warm ones. "I can handle that." "Can you? Because loving her isn't enough, Ethan. You have to love her even when she makes it difficult. You have to love her through tantrums and teenage rebellion and all the ways she'll try to push you away. You have to love her when she screams that she hates you, when she tells you that you're not her real father, when she says she wishes you had never come back." The picture she painted was terrifying in its honesty, but Ethan didn't flinch. "I will. I'll love her through all of it." Moana studied his face in the lamplight, searching for something she desperately needed to find. "She's going to need therapy. Professional help to deal with losing me, with the trauma of poverty, with having a father suddenly appear in her life. It's not something you can fix with money or good intentions. I'll make sure she gets whatever help she needs. And you'll need help too. Parenting classes, support groups, people who understand what it's like to raise a child who's experienced loss. Promise me you won't try to do this alone just because you're used to being self-reliant." "I promise." Moana was quiet for a long moment, and he could hear the effort it took for her to draw each breath. When she spoke again, her voice was even weaker than before. "There are things she needs to know about our family, about our culture. I've written letters for her birthdays, for when she graduates, for when she gets married. They're in a box under my bed at home. Make sure she gets them at the right times." "I will." "And teach her about her Maori heritage. Take her to Marae, let her learn to reo, make sure she knows where she comes from. She's not just your daughter, she's part of something bigger, something that connects her to generations of strong women who survived hardship and thrived. I'll make sure she knows her culture. There's money," she said suddenly, trying to sit up straighter and wincing with the effort. "Not much, but there's a savings account. About $3,000. I've been putting away $10 a week for her education since she was born. The account details are in the same box with the letters. $3,000. $10 a week from a woman who sometimes went without food to keep her daughter fed. The sacrifice behind that small sum was staggering. She won't need that money for education," he said gently, "but I'll make sure she knows what you did, how you saved for her future even when you could barely afford the present." Moana smiled then, the expression transforming her wasted features for just a moment into the beautiful woman he remembered. "You're going to be a good father to her. I can see it now, in the way you talk about her future, in the way you listen when I tell you what she needs. I should have been there from the beginning, maybe, but you're here now. And that's what matters. She's going to grow up knowing that when it really counted, when she needed you most, you showed up." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, her hand resting in his, both of them listening to the quiet sounds of the hospital at night. Through the window, Ethan could see the first faint hints of dawn painting the sky a pale pink. "Will you tell her something for me?" Moana asked as the light grew stronger. "Anything. Tell her that loving her was the greatest privilege of my life. Tell her that every sacrifice I made was worth it. That I never once regretted having her or wished my life had been different. Tell her that she made me proud every single day. Not because of what she achieved, but because of who she is." Tears were flowing freely down Ethan's cheeks now, and he made no effort to hide them. "I'll tell her. And tell her that I'm not really gone. Tell her that every time she helps someone who's struggling, every time she chooses kindness over anger, every time she sees beauty in simple things, I'm there with her. Tell her that love doesn't end when the person dies. It just changes form. Moana, promise me you'll remember me to her. Not just the sick woman in the hospital bed, but who I was before. Tell her about how I used to dance in the kitchen while cooking dinner, how I collected shells at the beach, how I sang Maori lullabies when she couldn't sleep. Make sure she knows I was more than just her dying mother. I promise. I'll tell her everything." As the sun fully rose, painting the hospital room in golden light, Moana's breathing became more labored. She was fighting to stay conscious, fighting to hold on to these last precious moments of lucidity. "I need to go get Aroha," Ethan said, starting to stand. "Not yet," Moana whispered urgently, gripping his hand with surprising strength. "Let her sleep a little longer. Let her have a few more hours of being a little girl who believes her mother will get better. There's time. But they both knew there wasn't much time left. Thank you, she said so quietly, he had to lean close to hear her. For what? For coming back. For choosing her. For giving me the chance to see that she'll be loved and cared for when I'm gone. For letting me die knowing that the most important thing I ever did, raising her, won't end with me. Moana, Shh, she interrupted, her eyes drifting closed. Go get our daughter. It's time for her to say goodbye. As Ethan walked back through the hospital corridors toward the car park, he carried with him the weight of promises made and the terrible knowledge that in just a few hours, he would have to help a 6-year-old girl say goodbye to the only parent she'd ever really known. The man who had once thought love was a weakness now understood that love was the strongest thing in the universe. It could survive poverty, neglect, years of separation, and even death itself. And now he would have to help Aroha discover that same truth in the midst of unimaginable loss. The hardest conversation of his life was waiting for him in a hotel room where a little girl slept peacefully, still believing that sometimes miracles happen and mothers don't die. But first he had to find the courage to wake her up and tell her it was time to let go. The sun was climbing higher in the morning sky when Ethan returned to the hotel, but it felt like the world had dimmed somehow, as though the light itself was mourning what was about to unfold. He found Aroha exactly where he'd left her, curled up in the big hotel bed, her small hand clutching the greenstone pendant that had become her constant companion. She woke as soon as he sat down beside her, those knowing brown eyes immediately searching his face for the truth he was trying so hard to hide. Is Mum worse? She asked simply, sitting up and pushing her tangled hair away from her face. There was no point in lying to her. Children, especially children who'd learned to read adult faces out of necessity, always knew when something terrible was coming. Yes, sweetheart, she's much worse. She wants to see you. Aroha nodded solemnly, as though she'd been expecting this moment for longer than any 6-year-old should have to. Is she going to die today? The directness of the question took his breath away. I think so. Yes. To his surprise, she didn't cry. Instead, she climbed out of bed with careful deliberation and went to the small pile of her belongings in the corner of the room. From it, she retrieved a piece of paper that had been folded and refolded so many times it was soft as cloth. I drew this for her yesterday, she said, unfolding it to reveal a picture of 2 figures floating on clouds above a third figure standing on the ground. That's Mum and Grandma Aroha together in heaven, and that's me down here. So she won't be alone when she goes, and I won't be alone when she's gone. The matter-of-fact way she spoke about death, about heaven, about being alone, was both heartbreaking and inspiring. This child had been preparing herself for loss with the same quiet courage her mother had shown throughout her illness. Can we go now? She asked, carefully folding the drawing again. I want to give this to her while she can still see it properly. The drive to the hospital was conducted in comfortable silence. Aroha sat in the back seat, wearing the nicest clothes she owned, a sundress that Moana had sewn for her from fabric bought at a church jumble sale, and the small cardigan that had belonged to her grandmother. Around her neck, the greenstone pendant caught the morning light, connecting her to ancestors who had faced their own losses with similar grace. When they reached Moana's room, it was clear that the end was very near. Her breathing was labored and irregular, and she was drifting in and out of consciousness. But when Aroha climbed carefully onto the bed beside her, Moana's eyes opened and focused with remarkable clarity. My beautiful girl, she whispered, her voice barely audible but full of love. I brought you something, Mum, Aroha said, unfolding her drawing and holding it where Moana could see it. It's you and Great-Grandma Aroha in heaven. She's been waiting for you, hasn't she? So you can teach her how to braid my hair from far away. Moana's eyes filled with tears as she studied the picture. It's perfect, my love. Absolutely perfect. I'm not scared for you to go, Aroha continued with the brutal honesty that only children possess. Because I know you'll still be taking care of me, just differently, and Dad will take care of me down here. The word Dad came so naturally now, as though Ethan had always been part of their family vocabulary. Moana's gaze shifted to him, and he saw relief and gratitude, and something that might have been peace in her expression. Will you sing to me? Moana asked Aroha. The lullaby I taught you? Aroha's voice was clear and pure as she began to sing in Te Reo Maori, the ancient words carrying centuries of love and loss and hope. It was a song about journeys and homecomings, about love that transcends physical presence, about the eternal connection between mothers and children. As she sang, Moana's breathing became slower, more peaceful. Her eyes remained fixed on her daughter's face, drinking in every detail as though trying to memorize it for eternity. Emoy, Emoy, my precious one, Moana whispered when the song ended. Sleep peacefully, knowing you are loved beyond measure. You too, Mum, Aroha replied, leaning down to kiss her mother's forehead. Sleep peacefully. We'll be okay. Those were the last words Moana heard. Her breathing gradually slowed, then stopped altogether, as peaceful as falling asleep. Aroha remained curled up beside her, holding her hand, for several long minutes after the monitors flatlined and the nurses came in to turn off the machines. When she finally looked up at Ethan, her eyes were dry but infinitely sad. She's gone, she said simply. But she's not really gone, is she? She's just somewhere I can't see her yet. Ethan gathered his daughter into his arms, and this time when she cried, it wasn't the desperate sobbing of a child who didn't understand what was happening. It was the deep, cleansing grief of someone saying goodbye to a love that would never end, even when the person who gave it was no longer physically present. 3 days later, they stood on the beach at Taranaki where Moana had asked to be scattered. The ceremony was small. Just Ethan, Aroha, Mrs. Hanare, and a few of Moana's friends from the community, where she'd taught sewing classes to women in need. The minister who conducted the service was a kind Maori woman who had known Moana from church and spoke about her generosity, her strength, and her devotion to her daughter. Aroha wore her best dress and carried the wooden urn that contained her mother's ashes. When it came time to scatter them, she walked to the edge of the water with Ethan beside her, and together they opened the urn and let the wind carry Moana back to the sea she had loved. Goodbye, Mum, Aroha whispered as the ashes disappeared into the waves. Thank you for everything. I'll take good care of Dad for you. As they walked back up the beach, Aroha slipped her hand into Ethan's and looked up at him with eyes that held wisdom far beyond her years. What happens now? She asked. Now we go home, he said. We figure out how to be a family together. We remember your mum by living the kind of life she wanted for you, full of love and kindness and possibility. Will you tell me stories about her? About when you loved each other before I was born? Every day if you want me to. And will you help me learn the things she was going to teach me? Like how to make her special kumara bread and how to weave flax and how to stand up for people who can't stand up for themselves? We'll learn together, he promised. That night in the hotel room they would leave tomorrow to start their new life together. Aroha sat at the small table and drew one more picture. This one showed a house. Not the broken-down house where she'd lived with Moana, but a new house with flowers in the garden and curtains in the windows. In front of the house stood two figures, a tall man and a small girl, both smiling. This is our new beginning, she told Ethan as she signed the drawing with both their names. Mom told me that endings are just beginnings wearing different clothes. As Ethan tucked his daughter into bed for the first night of their life as a real family, he marveled at how much she had taught him about love, about loss, about what truly mattered in life. She had lost the most important person in her world, yet she was still capable of hope, still able to see beauty in new beginnings. Good night, Dad, she whispered as he turned off the light. Good night, sweetheart. I love you. I love you too, and so does Mum, even though she's not here to say it anymore. Outside their hotel window, the lights of Wanganui twinkled like stars, and somewhere beyond them, the ocean that had claimed Moana's ashes whispered its eternal lullaby. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new lessons in how to be the father a remarkable little girl deserved. But tonight, as he listened to Aroha's peaceful breathing in the darkness, Ethan finally understood what Moana had been trying to tell him all those years ago. Love wasn't something that ended when people died. It was something that changed form, passing from one generation to the next like an eternal flame that could never be extinguished. And now it was his job to help that flame burn bright in the heart of a little girl who had already shown him what true courage looked like. 6 months had passed since they'd scattered Moana's ashes on the Taranaki coast, and the house in Rotorua that Ethan had bought for them was finally beginning to feel like home. It wasn't grand or ostentatious, just a modest 3-bedroom weatherboard cottage with a large garden where Aroha could plant the vegetables Moana had taught her to grow. The broken fence had been replaced with something sturdy but welcoming. The windows had curtains that Aroha had helped choose, and the kitchen table was scarred from homework sessions and art projects rather than business meetings. Ethan had kept his promise to step back from the empire he'd built, He'd sold his shares in the company, delegated responsibilities, and restructured his life around school runs and parent-teacher conferences. His mornings now began not with stock reports but with braiding Aroha's hair while she ate breakfast. His evenings ended not with late-night phone calls to international clients, but with bedtime stories about princesses who saved themselves and little girls who could talk to animals. The transformation hadn't been easy. There had been difficult days when Aroha's grief overwhelmed her, when she would scream that she wanted her mum and that he wasn't really her father, when she would test every boundary to see if he would abandon her like she'd been taught to expect. There had been nights when he'd sat on the bathroom floor, questioning whether he was equipped for the magnitude of what he'd taken on, wondering if Moana had been wrong to trust him with her most precious gift. But they had both learned to navigate the storms together. Aroha attended counseling with a gentle psychologist who specialized in childhood grief, while Ethan went to parenting classes and joined a support group for single fathers. They learned to communicate through the hard moments, to honor Moana's memory while building their own traditions, to be patient with each other's mistakes and fears. The house itself had become a testament to their journey. In the living room hung the drawing Aroha had made of their family at the mountains, now professionally framed alongside photographs of Moana that ensured her presence remained part of their daily life. Aroha's bedroom was decorated with her artwork and the treasures she collected on their weekend adventures: shells from beach walks, pressed flowers from hiking trails, smooth stones from riverside picnics. But it was the special room Ethan had created for Moana that truly showed how far they'd come. It wasn't a shrine. Aroha had been very clear about that. Instead, it was a celebration of a life well lived. Bookshelves filled with Moana's favorite novels and teaching materials, the traditional Maori cloak that had been her grandmother's, photographs spanning her entire life, and the box of letters she'd written for Aroha's future milestones. Every evening before bed, Aroha would spend a few minutes in that room, talking to her mother's photograph, sharing the events of her day, and asking for guidance only she could hear. "Mum would be proud of how our garden is growing," Aroha announced one Saturday morning as they worked together among the bean plants and kumara vines she'd insisted on planting. "Remember how she always said that the best things grow slowly, with patience and love?" Ethan paused in his weeding to watch his daughter carefully stake a tomato plant, her small hands confident with tasks Moana had taught her. At 7 now, she had grown taller and more self-assured, but she'd retained the gentle wisdom that had always been her defining characteristic. "She'd be proud of how you're growing too," he replied, and meant it completely. Their relationship had evolved into something beautiful and complex, not the instant father-daughter bond that movies portrayed, but something deeper and more real. They had inside jokes now, shared memories that belonged to them alone, traditions that honored Moana, while creating space for their own unique connection. Aroha had stopped testing whether he would leave and had begun trusting that he would stay, even when staying was difficult. The business world seemed like another lifetime now. Ethan's former colleagues occasionally called with opportunities that would have excited him immensely just a year earlier, but he found himself declining without a second thought. His definition of success had been fundamentally altered by a little girl who measured wealth in bedtime stories and quality time, rather than profit margins and stock options. "Dad, can we go to the lake today?" Aroha asked as they finished their gardening. "I want to show you the place Mum used to take me to feed the ducks." These pilgrimages to places that held memories of Moana had become an important part of their healing process. Rather than avoiding reminders of their loss, they had learned to seek them out, to celebrate the life that had brought them together rather than mourning only its end. Lake Rotorua was peaceful in the afternoon sunshine, its surface reflecting the surrounding hills like a mirror. Aroha led him to a small pier where she and Moana had apparently spent many happy hours, and together they scattered breadcrumbs for the ducks that still remembered the little girl who had once fed them regularly. "Mum used to say that ducks mate for life," Aroha said as they watched a pair swimming together in perfect synchronization. She said that's how she knew love was real, because even animals understood that some connections last forever. The comment was delivered with the matter-of-fact tone she used for all her philosophical observations, but it hit Ethan with unexpected force. This child, who had experienced more loss than most adults, still believed in forever kinds of love, still believed that connections could transcend physical presence. That love was the strongest force in the universe. "Do you think she can see us now?" Aroha asked, settling back against his chest as they sat on the pier. I think she sees us every time you help someone who's struggling, every time you choose kindness over anger, every time you see beauty in ordinary moments," he replied, echoing the words Moana had asked him to share. "And every time you read me stories and help with my homework and remember to pack my lunch with the crusts cut off the sandwiches." Especially then, they sat in comfortable silence, watching the ducks and the gentle movement of the water. It was the kind of moment that would have seemed impossibly boring to the man Ethan used to be. No agenda, no measurable outcome, no strategic purpose. Now he recognized it as the most valuable kind of time. The simple, unhurried connection between a father and daughter who had learned to treasure each other. "I'm glad you came back," Aroha said suddenly, turning to look at him with those serious brown eyes that still sometimes took his breath away. "Even though it was sad that Mom had to get sick for it to happen, I'm glad you're my dad now." "I'm glad too, sweetheart. Being your father is the best thing I've ever done. Better than all those business deals and making lots of money. So much better that there's no comparison." She smiled at this, the brilliant smile that reminded him of Moana and filled him with pride at the same time. "Good, because I like you much better as a dad than I think I would have liked you as a businessman." That evening, as they prepared dinner together in their kitchen, Aroha standing on a stool to help stir the kumara bread they were making from Moana's recipe, Ethan reflected on how completely his life had changed. The penthouse in New Plymouth had been sold, along with most of his luxury possessions. He drove a modest family car now, shopped at the local supermarket, and knew the names of all Aroha's teachers and classmates. But he was richer than he'd ever been when money was his primary concern. Rich in the laughter of a little girl who thought his terrible dad jokes were hilarious. Rich in the trust of a child who had chosen to love him despite his failures. Rich in the knowledge that he was honoring the memory of a woman who had seen something worthwhile in him, even when he couldn't see it himself. "Dad," Aroha said as they sat down to eat their dinner, "when I grow up and have children of my own, will you tell them stories about their grandmother Moana, so they'll know where they came from and why she was special?" "Every story I know," he promised, "and maybe by then, you'll have some stories of your own to share about how she guided you even after she was gone." "I already do," she said matter-of-factly. "Sometimes when I don't know what to do, I think about what Mum would say, and I can hear her voice in my head. She always knows the right answer." After dinner, they settled into their evening routine. Homework at the kitchen table, baths and teeth brushing, a chapter from whatever book they were reading together, and finally prayers and good nights. But before Ethan could turn off the light, Aroha sat up in bed with something important to say. "I've been thinking about that day when you got my phone call," she said, "when I was so scared and I called you Papai, even though I didn't really know if you were my father or not." "What about it?" "I think Mom knew she was getting sicker, and she told me to call you because she knew you would come. Even though you hadn't been there before, she knew that when it really mattered, you would choose us." The insight was profound, suggesting depths of understanding about adult motivations that continued to amaze him. "Why do you think she knew that?" "Because love doesn't really disappear, even when people make mistakes or go away for a while. It just waits, and Mum could see the love in you that was waiting to come back to us." As he tucked the blankets around his remarkable daughter and kissed her forehead goodnight, Ethan marveled once again at the wisdom contained in someone so young. She was right, of course. The love had been waiting, buried under years of ambition and emotional armor, but never truly gone. Outside their window, the lights of Rotorua twinkled peacefully, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the gentle sound of the lake lapping against its shores. It was a sound that spoke of continuity, of cycles that repeated endlessly, of love that flowed like water from one generation to the next. "Good night, sweetheart," he whispered. "I love you. I love you too, Dad. And tomorrow, can we start planning my birthday party? I want to invite all my friends, and I want to make Mum's special chocolate cake so she can be part of the celebration too." "Of course we can." As Aroha drifted off to sleep, Ethan sat for a while in the comfortable chair beside her bed, watching the peaceful rise and fall of her breathing and thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, he had been a man with millions of dollars, but no one to love. Tonight, he was a man of modest means but infinite richness, measured in the trust of a child who called him Dad and meant it with her whole heart. He thought about Moana, whose sacrifice and wisdom had made this transformation possible. She had given him not just a daughter to love, but a chance to become the man she had always believed he could be. In losing her, he had found himself, Or perhaps had found the version of himself that had been waiting all along for someone to love enough to change for. Tomorrow would bring new adventures. Birthday party planning, school projects, weekend expeditions to places Aroha wanted to explore. There would be scraped knees to bandage, fears to comfort, achievements to celebrate, and the thousand small moments that make up the real treasure of family life. But tonight, in the quiet darkness of their home, Ethan simply gave thanks for the phone call that had changed everything. For the little girl who had taught him what love really meant, and for the woman whose dying wish had been that her daughter would be loved unconditionally for the rest of her life. He was a millionaire who had lost his fortune to find his soul, a businessman who had traded profit for purpose, a man who had thought he was too important for ordinary love, only to discover that ordinary love was the most extraordinary thing in the universe. He was Aroha's father, and that was the only identity that mattered anymore. What if you received a call that changed everything? If a fragile voice on the other end called you mom or dad, even though you'd spent your entire life denying that possibility? How many times does pride make us lose what's most precious? And when life gives us a second chance, do we have the courage to accept it before it's too late? Perhaps what destroys us most isn't what we've done, but what we've failed to do. Ethan had everything: money, success, power, but only discovered what was truly valuable when he could no longer save the person who needed him most. And you? Would you have the courage to turn back? Would you have the strength to love a child who was born while you were too busy with the world? Or would you choose to keep pretending you never heard that voice? If this story touched your heart, like it, share it with someone who needs to hear this. And follow the channel so you won't miss other stories that remind us what truly matters in life. Sometimes, what seems like a simple phone call is destiny knocking at your door. And tell me, which city are you watching from? I want to know where this story has reached.